The trade station known as Vela Prime floated in the darkness of space like a city made of metal and light. And thousands of alien species walked through its corridors every single day, buying and selling goods from across the galaxy, speaking in languages that no human had ever heard before the first contact happened just 5 years ago. Kevin Shaw held his daughter's hand tightly as they walked through the crowded market plaza, and he could feel her small fingers squeezing back with excitement and a little bit of fear, because everything around them was so strange and so different from the quiet town in Ohio where they had lived before his wife passed away. 2 years ago, Lucy was only 9 years old, but she had already seen more of the galaxy than most humans would ever see in their entire lives. And her big brown eyes moved from one alien merchant to another, taking in the colors and the sounds and the smells that filled the massive open space of the market. "Daddy, look at that one," Lucy whispered, pointing at a tall creature with blue skin and 4 arms, who was selling what looked like glowing fruit from a wooden cart. Kevin smiled down at her and nodded, but his eyes were always moving, always watching, because he knew that not every species in the galaxy was friendly to humans, and some of them saw Earth's people as nothing more than weak newcomers who did not deserve a place among the stars. Commander Nathan Brooks walked a few steps behind them with 3 other members of the security team, all of them wearing civilian clothes so they would not attract too much attention. But Kevin knew that each of them carried weapons hidden beneath their jackets, ready for any trouble that might come their way. The human delegation had arrived on Vela Prime 3 days ago to finalize a trade agreement that would give Earth its first independent trading post in this sector of the galaxy, and Kevin was the lead negotiator, chosen because he had a gift for reading people and finding common ground, even with species that looked nothing like humans. But the real reason he had taken this job was walking right beside him, holding his hand and asking questions about every strange thing she saw, because after his wife died, Kevin could not bear to leave Lucy alone on Earth for months at a time while he worked off-world. So he had made a deal with the delegation leaders to bring her along. "Stay close to me, sweetheart," Kevin said softly as they moved deeper into the market. And Lucy nodded without taking her eyes off a group of small furry creatures that were performing acrobatic tricks for coins. Near a fountain, Valorians were the dominant species on this station, and Kevin had learned everything he could about them before arriving, because understanding your hosts was the first rule of successful negotiation. They were tall, standing nearly 7 feet on average, with thick gray skin that looked almost like stone, and their faces were flat with wide mouths full of sharp teeth that they showed when they were angry or when they were pleased, which made reading their emotions very difficult for outsiders. The Valorians were warriors above all else, and they had conquered dozens of worlds before joining the Galactic Assembly and agreeing to follow the rules of peaceful trade. But old habits died hard, and many of them still looked at smaller species with open contempt. Kevin had seen the way some of them stared at the human delegation during the negotiations. Their yellow eyes filled with something that was not quite hatred, but was definitely not respect either. And he had learned to ignore it, because getting angry would only make things worse. "The Valorians think we are soft," Commander Brooks had told him on their first night aboard the station. "They see our size and our smooth skin, and they think we are prey animals who somehow learned to build starships." Kevin had just smiled at that and said nothing, because he knew something that the Valorians did not know, something that most aliens in the galaxy had not yet learned about the people of Earth. The market was getting more crowded now as the station's artificial day cycle moved toward what the locals called the golden hour, when most species finished their work and came out to shop and socialize. And Kevin could feel Lucy pressing closer to his leg as the crowd pushed in around them. "It is okay," he told it gently. "Just stay with me and you will be fine." But Lucy's attention had already been captured by something new. a stall selling small mechanical toys that moved and danced on their own, and she pulled at her father's hand, trying to get a closer look. "Can we go see Daddy, please?" she asked with that voice she always used when she really wanted something. And Kevin could never say no to that voice. So he let her lead him toward the stall, while Commander Brooks and his team adjusted their positions to keep them in sight. The toys were beautiful. Kevin had to admit, little robots shaped like animals from 100 different worlds, spinning and jumping and chasing each other across the merchant's table. And Lucy laughed with pure joy as she watched them play. Kevin was reaching for his credit chip to buy one for her when he felt the crowd shift behind him, and a shadow fell over them both, blocking out the light from the glowing signs above. He turned and found himself looking at a wall of gray flesh covered in ceremonial scars, and he had to tilt his head back to see the face of the Valorian warrior who had stepped into their path. The alien was massive, even by Valorian standards, with shoulders as wide as a doorway and arms thick with muscle. And he wore the golden bands of a warlord on his wrists, marking him as one of the highest-ranking military officers in the Valorian fleet. His name was Krathvex, and Kevin recognized him from the briefing files as a decorated war hero who had killed more enemies in battle than most soldiers would ever see in a lifetime, and who had made no secret of his belief that humans were unworthy of a place in the galactic community. Krathvex was staring down at them with those cold yellow eyes, and his wide mouth was pulled back to show his teeth in an expression that Kevin knew was not friendly at all. Lucy had not noticed the warrior yet, because she was still watching the dancing toys, and Kevin felt his heart begin to beat faster as he stepped slightly in front of his daughter, putting himself between her and the alien. "Can I help you with something?" Kevin asked in a calm voice, even though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to grab Lucy, and Runkerthvix did not answer right away. And instead, he just stood there looking at Kevin like he was examining an insect that had crawled across his path. And the crowd around them had started to notice the confrontation and was backing away to give the warlord space. Then Lucy turned around to show her father her favorite toy, and she bumped right into the Valorian's leg without seeing him, and her small body bounced off his thick gray skin, and she stumbled backward with a surprised yelp. Everything went very quiet. Krathvex looked down at the small human child who had just touched him without permission, and his yellow eyes burned with sudden anger. And Kevin felt his blood turn to ice in his veins as the alien warrior reached down with one massive hand. The massive gray hand closed around the collar of Lucy's jacket and lifted her off the ground like she weighed nothing at all. And the little girl's legs kicked in the air as she let out a scream of pure terror that cut through the noise of the market. Like a knife, Kevin felt something snap inside his chest, something that he had kept locked away for many years, ever since he had left the military and promised his wife that he would never be that person again. But that promise meant nothing now, because his daughter was dangling from the grip of a monster, and she was crying out for him to help her. "Daddy!" Lucy screamed, her small hands grabbing at the alien's thick fingers as tears streamed down her face. "Daddy, help me!" Krathvex held her up like a trophy and looked at Kevin with a smile that showed every single one of his sharp teeth. And his voice rumbled like thunder when he spoke. "Your offspring has insulted me." "Human," the warlord said loudly so that everyone in the crowd could hear him. "She has touched a warrior of the Valorian Empire without permission, and this is an offense that demands satisfaction." The crowd had formed a circle around them now, dozens of alien species watching the confrontation with expressions that ranged from fear to curiosity to sick excitement. And Kevin could see Commander Brooks and his team pushing through the bodies, trying to reach them, but they were too far away. "Put her down," Kevin said, and his voice came out flat and empty, without any of the fear that was clawing at his insides. "Put her down right now," Krathvex laughed. a harsh barking sound that made Lucy cry even harder. And he shook her slightly just to watch Kevin flinch. "You will kneel before me." "Human," the warlord commanded. "You will kneel and beg for forgiveness. And perhaps I will let your weak little offspring go without breaking any of her fragile bones." Lucy was sobbing now, her whole body shaking with fear. And Kevin could see the red marks forming on her neck where the alien's grip was pressing too tight against her skin. And something in his brain went very cold and very calm. He had spent 8 years in the Special Forces before Lucy was born. And he had trained with the best warriors Earth had ever produced. And when first contact happened, he had been one of the soldiers chosen to learn everything there was to know about alien physiology, because the generals wanted to be ready in case the visitors from the stars turned out to be enemies instead of friends. Kevin knew things about Valorian anatomy that most humans would never learn. Secrets that were buried in classified files and protected by security clearances that did not officially exist. And right now, those secrets were scrolling through his mind like a list of options on a Menocrath Vex. Was still laughing, still enjoying the fear in the human father's eyes. And he did not see the change that came over Kevin's face. Did not notice the way his shoulders dropped slightly and his weight shifted to the balls of his feet. "I said kneel." "Human," the warlord roared, shaking Lucy again. "Kneel before your betters, or watch your offspring suffer." Kevin moved. He did not run or charge or do any of the things that Krathvax might have expected from a frightened father trying to save his child, because those movements were too slow and too predictable. And instead he simply flowed forward like water, his body dropping low and then rising, in a single smooth motion that brought him inside the warlord's guard before the alien even realized he was in danger. His right hand shot out in a strike that was almost too fast to see. 2 fingers extended like a spear, and they found the soft spot on the side of Krathvex's thick neck where the vocal nerve cluster was located. The one weakness in the Valorian throat that was not protected by their stone-like skin. The impact was precise and devastating. Krathvex's eyes went wide with shock and pain, and his mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. Just a thin whistle of air that was barely louder than a whisper. And his grip on Lucy's collar went slack as his whole body began to convulse. Kevin caught his daughter before she could hit the ground, pulling her against his chest and spinning away from the falling alien in one smooth motion. And he held her tight as Krathvex collapsed to his knees and then fell forward onto his face, his massive body twitching and jerking on the metal floor of the market. The crowd was completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, and every alien eye in the plaza was fixed on the small human man who was holding his crying daughter and watching the greatest warrior in the Valorian fleet writhe on the ground like a dying animal. Commander Brooks finally reached them, his team forming a protective circle around Kevin and Lucy, with their weapons now visible in their hands. And the security officer's face was pale as he looked at what Kevin had done. "Shaw," Brooks said quietly, "what did you do to him?" "I destroyed his vocal cords," Kevin answered without taking his eyes off Krathvax. "The nerve cluster that controls Valorian speech is connected directly to their respiratory system. And if you hit it hard enough in exactly the right spot, the damage is permanent." Brooks stared at him for a long moment before speaking again. "He will never speak again?" "No," Kevin said, and his voice was still flat and empty. "He will never speak again." Lucy was burying her face in her father's shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. And Kevin held her close and whispered soft words of comfort into her ear while the crowd finally began to react. Voices rising in shock and disbelief as station security officers pushed their way through the mass of bodies. Krathvix had stopped convulsing now, but he was still lying on the ground, his yellow eyes staring at nothing while his mouth opened and closed without making a sound. and the other Valorians in the crowd were looking at the fallen warlord with expressions that Kevin could not read. "We need to go," Brooks said urgently. "Right now, before this gets any worse." But before they could move, a group of Valorian guards appeared at the edge of the crowd, their weapons raised and their faces twisted with rage. And behind them, Kevin could see more warriors gathering, their eyes fixed on the human who had struck down one of their greatest heroes. "Nobody leaves," one of the guards shouted, his voice echoing across the suddenly quiet market. "The human will answer for this crime." Kevin looked at the guards, then down at his daughter, who was still crying against his chest. And he made a decision. "I will answer for nothing," he said calmly. "Your warlord attacked my child, and I defended her. And if any of you want to test what happens when you threaten a human's family, you are welcome to try." The guards hesitated, and Kevin saw something in their eyes that he had seen many times before in the eyes of predators who had just realized they were not the most dangerous thing in the room. Fear. The medical bay of the Valorian military complex was cold and sterile, filled with machines that hummed and beeped as they monitored the vital signs of the patient lying on the examination table. And Krathvax stared at the ceiling with empty eyes while doctors moved around him. Like ghosts, he had been unconscious for nearly 6 hours after the human struck him. And when he finally woke up, the first thing he tried to do was scream for vengeance. But all that came out of his mouth was a thin, whistling sound that was barely louder than the wind. The doctors had explained it to him 3 times already, using small words and simple diagrams, because they thought the trauma had damaged his ability to understand. But Krathvax understood perfectly well what had happened to him, a human. One of those small, soft creatures that he had mocked and despised since the first day they appeared in the galaxy, had destroyed his ability to speak with a single strike. And the damage was permanent, irreversible, and complete. He would never give another battle cry, never command his troops with his voice, never speak the ancient war chants of his ancestors that he had learned as a child. And all of this had been taken from him by a creature half his size who had moved faster than anything Krathvax had ever seen in his 200 years of life. The door to the medical bay opened and High Speaker Morath entered, his ancient face carved with lines of worry and confusion. And behind him came a delegation of senior Valorian officials who looked just as troubled as their leader. Morath was the oldest living Valorian, a warrior who had fought in the last great war before the Empire joined the Galactic Assembly, and his word carried more weight than anyone else in their society. "Even more than the War Council itself, Krathvax," Morath said, standing beside the examination table and looking down at the fallen warlord. "Can you tell me what happened in the market?" Krathvax opened his mouth and tried to speak, but only that same thin whistle emerged, and he slammed his fist against the table in frustration, making the medical equipment rattle and shake. "He cannot speak," one of the doctors said quietly. "The damage to his vocal nerve cluster is complete, and we have no way to repair it." Morath's eyes narrowed as he studied Krathvax's face, reading the rage and humiliation that burned there. And then he turned to one of his aides. "Bring the humans here," he commanded. "I want to hear their account of what happened." It took less than an hour for Commander Brooks and Kevin Shaw to arrive at the medical complex, escorted by a squad of Valorian guards who kept their weapons trained on the humans at all times. And Lucy was not with them because she had been taken back to the human ship where she would be safe. Kevin walked into the medical bay with his head held high and his eyes calm, showing no fear even though he was surrounded by warriors who would have loved nothing more than to tear him apart for what he had done to their hero. "You are the one who struck Warlord Krathvax?" Morath asked, his voice cold and formal. "I am," Kevin answered without hesitation. "You understand that attacking a Valorian officer is a crime punishable by death under our laws." I understand that your officer attacked my daughter first, Kevin replied. A 9-year-old child who bumped into him by accident. And he grabbed her by the throat and lifted her off the ground and threatened to break her bones. Morath was silent for a moment. And then he gestured to one of his aides, who activated a holographic display that showed security footage from the market. The recording played in silence, showing Lucy bumping into Krathvex, showing the warlord grabbing her and lifting her into the air, showing Kevin's face change from fear to something else entirely, and then showing the strike that happened so fast it was almost invisible, followed by Krathvex collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut when the footage ended. Morath turned to look at Kevin with new eyes, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before. How did you know where to strike? The high speaker asked slowly. The vocal nerve cluster is not common knowledge, even among our own warriors. Commander Brooks stepped forward and spoke in a clear, professional voice. Kevin Shaw served in Earth's Special Operations Forces for 8 years. Before becoming a civilian negotiator, he explained. When humanity made first contact with the galaxy, our military created training programs to prepare our soldiers for potential conflicts with alien species. And Shaw was one of the first to complete that training. Morath looked at Kevin with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. You were trained specifically to fight Valorians? I was trained to protect humanity from any threat, Kevin said calmly. Your species was one of many that we studied, and I learned everything there was to know about your anatomy, your weaknesses, and the most efficient ways to disable your warriors without killing them. Without killing them? Morath repeated, and his voice carried a note of genuine confusion. You chose not to kill him? Kevin's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, the cold emptiness in his eyes flickered with something much darker. My daughter was watching, he said quietly. I did not want her to see me kill someone, so I showed mercy instead, but make no mistake, High Speaker. If Krathvex had hurt her in any real way, I would have torn his throat out with my bare hands, and nothing in this galaxy could have stopped me. The medical bay went completely silent. Every Valorian in the room was staring at the small human man who had just told them, without any emotion in his voice, that he had held back from killing one of their greatest warriors because his child was present. And they were all trying to understand what kind of creature could make such a statement and mean. Every single word of it. Morath turned to look at Krathvex, who was still lying on the table with rage burning in his yellow eyes. And the High Speaker's expression was thoughtful. Under the sanctuary laws of this station, Morath said slowly, the unprovoked attack of a child is one of the most serious offenses that can be committed, regardless of the species involved. Krathvex made a sound that might have been a protest, but it came out as nothing more than a weak whistle. You violated those laws. Warlord, Morath continued, his voice growing harder. You attacked a human child because she accidentally touched you, and you did so in full view of dozens of witnesses. And now you expect us to punish the father who defended her? The other Valorian officials shifted uncomfortably, and Kevin could see the conflict in their faces as they struggled between their loyalty to one of their own and their understanding that Krathvex had been wrong. The human will not be punished for defending his offspring, Morath declared, his voice ringing with authority. And Krathvex will face a tribunal for his actions, as our laws demand. Kevin felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he kept his face neutral as he looked at the High Speaker. I have one request, he said quietly. Morath raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that the human would dare to ask for anything after what had just happened. Speak. I ask that his punishment be lenient, Kevin said, and everyone in the room stared at him like he had just grown a second head. He has already lost his voice forever, and for a warrior of your people, that is punishment enough. Morath studied Kevin's face for a long moment. And something changed in the old warrior's eyes. Something that looked almost like wonder. "You show mercy to the one who threatened your child?" Kevin met his gaze without flinching. "I show mercy because my daughter would want me to," he answered. "And because humans know that true strength is not about destroying your enemies, but about choosing not to when you have every right to do so." Marth was quiet for a very long time, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was soft with something that might have been awe. "I think we have underestimated your species, Kevin Shaw." The news spread across Villa Prime like wildfire, and by the end of the day, every species on the station was talking about what had happened in the market plaza. About the small human father who had struck down a Valorian warlord with a single blow and then asked for mercy on behalf of the alien who had attacked his daughter in the diplomatic quarter. Ambassadors from a dozen worlds were suddenly very interested in learning more about humanity, a species they had dismissed as unremarkable newcomers just days before. And research requests flooded the station's information networks as curious aliens dug through human history looking for answers. What they found terrified them. The archives were filled with records of human wars that had killed millions of their own kind. Conflicts fought over land and resources and ideas that seemed trivial compared to the scale of destruction they caused. And the aliens who read these histories struggled to understand how a species could survive such violence against itself. They learned about human endurance, about the way these small, soft creatures could run for hours without stopping, chasing their prey across vast distances until their targets collapsed from exhaustion. And this was how early humans hunted before they invented weapons. By simply refusing to give up until their prey could run no more. They learned about human pack bonding, the strange and powerful connections that humans formed with each other and even with other species. Bonds so strong that humans would willingly die to protect those they loved. And this instinct extended beyond their own families to include friends, communities, and even strangers who needed help, and they learned about human children, about the sacred place that offspring held in human society, about the lengths that human parents would go to protect their young. And they began to understand why Kevin Shaw had responded the way he did when Krathvex threatened his daughter on the human vessel Horizon's Edge. I-Speaker Morth sat across from Kevin in the small diplomatic chamber, a cup of untouched tea cooling on the table between them, and Lucy was sleeping in the next room, finally calm after a day that had shaken her more than anything else in her young life. "I have read your histories," Morth said slowly, his ancient voice heavy with something that might have been concern. "I have studied your wars and your conquests and your capacity for violence, and I confess that I do not understand your species." Kevin leaned back in his chair and met the old warrior's eyes. "What do you not understand?" "You are capable of such destruction," Morth said. "You have killed each other by the millions over pieces of land that would fit inside a single Valorian city. And yet you show mercy to an enemy who threatened your child. And your daughter worries about the welfare of the creature who attacked her." Kevin was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to explain something that he had always taken for granted, something that was so fundamental to being human that he had never needed to put it into words before. "We are both," he finally said. "We are the violence and the mercy, the destruction and the compassion. And we carry both of these things inside us every single day of our lives." Morth tilted his head, clearly waiting for more. "When I served in the military," Kevin continued, "I was trained to kill in dozens of different ways, and I was good at it, maybe too good. And there was a time in my life when I thought that violence was all I would ever be." He paused and looked toward the door that led to Lucy's room. "Then I met my wife, and we had Lucy, and everything changed," he said quietly. "I learned that the same instincts that made me dangerous in combat could be turned toward protection instead of destruction. And I promised myself that I would only use those skills to keep my family safe. But you did use them today, Morith pointed out. You could have killed Krathvex easily. I saw that in the footage. And yet you chose not to. Because Lucy was watching, Kevin repeated. Because I want her to grow up knowing that violence is a last resort, not a first response, and because even when we are forced to hurt someone, we do not have to destroy them completely. Morith was silent for a long time, processing these words in a mind that had spent 2 centuries seeing the galaxy through the lens of a warrior culture that valued strength above all else. Among my people, the High Speaker finally said, mercy is seen as weakness, as a failure to finish what you have started. But I am beginning to think that perhaps we have been wrong about this. Kevin nodded slowly. Mercy is not weakness, he said. Mercy is the choice you make when you have all the power, and you decide not to use it. And that choice requires more strength than any act of violence ever could. There was a soft sound from the doorway, and both men turned to see Lucy standing there in her pajamas, her eyes still puffy from crying. And she was clutching a small stuffed animal that her mother had given her before she died. Daddy? She said in a small voice, is the big gray man going to be okay? Kevin felt his heart squeeze in his chest, and he held out his arms for her. Come here, sweetheart. Lucy ran to him and climbed into his lap, and he held her close while she looked at Morith with curious eyes. No longer afraid now that she was safe in her father's arms. The man who grabbed you is going to live, Kevin told her gently. But he will never be able to talk again because of what I did to him. Lucy's face scrunched up with concern. That is sad, she said. Even if he was mean to me, that is really sad. Mara stared at the child with an expression of complete astonishment. And Kevin could see the old warrior struggling to understand how a creature so small and fragile could feel sympathy for someone who had hurt her just hours ago. Your daughter is remarkable, Morith said, and his voice was rough with emotion. All human children are like this, Kevin replied. They are born with the capacity for both cruelty and kindness, just like we are. But they lean toward kindness unless the world teaches them otherwise. And it is our job as parents to protect that kindness for as long as we can. Lucy looked up at Morith and tilted her head. Are you a good guy or a bad guy? She asked with the blunt honesty that only children possess. Morith let out a sound that might have been a laugh. The first time Kevin had heard anything like that from a Valorian. I am trying to be a good guy, the High Speaker answered. But I think your people might need to teach us how. Lucy nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to her. Daddy can teach you, she said confidently. He is really good at teaching people to be nice. Kevin hugged his daughter tighter and looked at Morith over the top of her head. And something passed between the two fathers, because Morith had children of his own somewhere in the vastness of the Valorian Empire. And he understood now, perhaps for the first time, what it truly meant to protect them. I would like that very much, Morith said softly. And there was no trace of the proud warrior in his voice now. Just an old man who had learned something new about the universe and was still trying to figure out what it meant. Then let us start tomorrow, Kevin said, because today has been long enough. And my daughter needs to sleep. Morith rose from his chair and gave a small bow that Kevin suspected was a great honor among his people. Tomorrow, the High Speaker agreed. And he left the human ship with more questions than answers, but also with something else, hope. 1 week had passed since the incident in the market, and Velar Prime had changed in ways that no one could have predicted, because word had spread beyond the station to the rest of the galaxy, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about the strange species from the small blue planet called Earth. Krathvex stood in the departure bay of the station, stripped of his golden wristbands and his military rank, wearing the plain gray clothing of a civilian instead of the ceremonial armor he had worn for nearly 2 centuries. and his yellow eyes were fixed on the human ship that was preparing to leave. The tribunal had been swift and decisive, and High Speaker Morath had shown no mercy to the fallen warlord, despite Kevin Shaw's request for leniency, because the laws were clear and Krathvex had violated them in the most serious way possible by attacking a child under the protection of the Sanctuary Agreement. His voice was gone forever. His career was over, and his name would be remembered, not as a hero, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating those who seemed weak. But Krathvex had not come to the departure bay to protest his punishment, or to seek revenge against the human who had destroyed his life, because something had changed inside him during the long nights he spent lying awake in his quarters, unable to sleep as he replayed the events of that day over and over again in his mind. He had spent his entire life believing that strength was everything, that the strong ruled and the weak served, and that mercy was nothing but a fancy word for cowardice. But the human had shown him something different, something that he was still struggling to understand. Kevin Shaw could have killed him easily, and no one would have blamed him, because the laws of every civilized world recognize the right of a parent to defend their child with lethal force. But the human had chosen not to, had deliberately held back from ending his life because his daughter was watching. That choice haunted Krathvex more than the loss of his voice ever could. The doors of the human ship opened, and Kevin Shaw walked down the ramp with Lucy holding his hand, followed by Commander Brooks and the rest of the security team. And they were all dressed in formal clothes for the ceremony that was about to take place. High Speaker Morath was waiting for them at the center of the departure bay, surrounded by representatives from the Valorian Council and ambassadors from half a dozen other species who had come to witness this historic moment. And the old warrior's face was solemn as the humans approached. Kevin Shaw of Earth, Morath said in a voice that carried across the entire bay. You came to Vila Prime seeking a trade agreement, and you are leaving with something much more valuable. He gestured to one of his aides, who stepped forward carrying a ornate box made of the same gray stone that covered Valorian skin. The Council has voted unanimously to offer Earth a full alliance with the Valorian Empire. Morath continued, not as a junior partner or a protected species, but as equals, with all the rights and responsibilities that this entails. Kevin accepted the box and opened it to reveal a medallion carved with symbols that Lucy thought looked like stars and swords. And he looked up at Morath with surprise in his eyes. This is more than we asked for, he said. Much more. It is what you have earned, Morath replied. You showed us something that we had forgotten, something that our warrior culture had taught us to despise. And you did it without trying to prove anything or make us feel ashamed. He turned to address the crowd, his voice rising with emotion. Let it be known across the galaxy that the Valorian Empire stands with humanity, he declared. And let it be known that any who threaten their children will answer to both of our peoples. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Kevin felt Lucy squeeze his hand as she looked around at all the aliens who were celebrating because of something her father had done. But Kevin's eyes had found Krathvex standing at the edge of the crowd, the former warlord watching the ceremony with an expression that was impossible to read. And without thinking, Kevin handed the medallion box to Commander Brooks and walked toward the alien who had started all of this. The crowd fell silent as they watched the human approach the disgraced warrior. And Krathvex stood very still, not sure what to expect from the man who had taken everything from him. Kevin stopped a few feet away and looked up at the Valorian's face. And for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Kevin spoke, his voice quiet but clear. I am sorry for what happened, he said. I did what I had to do to protect my daughter, but I am sorry that it cost you so much. Krathvex stared at him with those yellow eyes, and then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device that Kevin recognized as a translation unit. the kind that converted thoughts into speech for those who could no longer speak with their own voices. The device hummed softly, and then it spoke in a mechanical voice that carried none of the warmth of real speech but conveyed the words that Krathvex wanted to say. "I was wrong about your kind," the device said. "I thought you were weak because you were small and soft, and you smiled too easily. But I understand now that I was the weak one. Because true strength is not about size or power." He paused, and the device hummed again. "True strength is about choosing mercy when you have the power to destroy. And you showed me that, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand what it means." Kevin nodded slowly. And then he did something that shocked everyone who was watching. He extended his hand. Krathvex looked at the offered hand for a long moment. And then his translation device spoke again. "What is this gesture?" "It is how humans greet those they respect," Kevin explained. "And how we make peace with former enemies." The former warlord hesitated, and then slowly, carefully, he reached out and wrapped his massive gray fingers around Kevin's small human hand, and they shook once, firmly. While the crowd watched in stunned silence, Lucy had been watching from where Commander Brooks was holding her hand, and she pulled free and ran across the departure bay toward her father and the alien, who had grabbed her just 1 week ago. "Wait," she called out, and everyone turned to look at the small human girl who was running toward them with something clutched in her hand. She stopped in front of Krathvex and held up a small bracelet made of colorful beads strung on a piece of elastic cord. "The kind of craft project that children made in schools across Earth. I made this for you," Lucy said, looking up at the massive alien without any fear in her eyes. "Daddy said you have to wear plain clothes now because you got in trouble. And I thought maybe you would want something pretty to wear instead." Krathvex stared down at the child, and something shifted in his yellow eyes. Something that looked almost like tears, even though Valorians were not supposed to be capable of crying. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself closer to Lucy's level, and he held out his hand so she could slip the bracelet onto his thick gray wrist. And it looked tiny and ridiculous against his stone-like skin. But he made no move to take it off. His translation device hummed one last time. "Thank you, little one," it said. "I will wear it always. And I will remember." Lucy smiled at him. That bright, innocent smile that children give to everyone, regardless of whether they deserve it. And then she ran back to her father and took his hand again 2 hours later. The Horizon's Edge left Velo Prime and jumped into hyperspace, carrying the human delegation back toward Earth with an alliance that would change the course of galactic history. Kevin sat in his cabin with Lucy sleeping against his shoulder, her breath soft and steady as the stars streamed past the window. And he watched the light play across her peaceful face while he thought about everything that had happened. He had come to this station as a negotiator, hoping to secure a small trading post for humanity. And he was leaving as the architect of an alliance that would make Earth one of the most protected planets in the galaxy. But none of that mattered as much as the little girl sleeping in his arms, safe and unharmed and still capable of forgiving those who had hurt her. Kevin kissed the top of her head and closed his eyes. "I hope you never have to see that side of me again," he whispered into her hair. "I hope the galaxy learns to be kind, so you never have to know what your father is capable of when someone threatens the things he loves." Outside the window, the stars continued to burn in the endless darkness. And somewhere back on Velo Prime, a former warlord sat alone in his quarters, staring at a colorful bracelet made by a human child, and wondering if it was possible to become something better than what he had always been. And across the galaxy, other species were reading reports about what had happened on Velo Prime, and they were adding new entries to their databases about humanity, entries that warned future generations to be careful around the small soft creatures from the little blue planet because humans smiled. easily, and spoke softly, and loved their children more than life itself, and those who threatened what they loved did not walk away whole.